Come close now, child. Come real close. Sit here in the shade of this old oak tree, the kind that's seen tears fall like summer rain, seen blood soak into red Carolina clay, seen souls break and spirits rise all at once. Now listen here, folk. What I'm about to tell you ain't in no school book, ain't on no museum wall, ain't in no preacher's Sunday sermon. This here story is bone-deep truth, the kind that burns when you swallow it, the kind that echoes from high the quarters, long after the big house crumbles to dust. This is the story of Betty High. Not Elizabeth, no fancy name for a woman they tried to erase, just Betty. Betty, who crossed the middle passage in chains and came out the other side with fire still burning in her chest. Betty, who worked them cotton fields, from can't-see morning to can't-see night, but never let her back bend permanent. Betty, who looked a white overseer dead in the eye and said the one word that slaves weren't supposed to know. No. And for that, Lord have mercy, for that one word, they who hanged her. Strung her up like she was nothing, like she was property gone bad, like her soul didn't matter to God Almighty himself. Now you might ask, why we gotta hear this? Why dig up old pain? I'll tell you why, Kinchiu, because forgetting is the second death. Because when we stop saying their names, when we stop telling what they endured, when we let the plantation ground and swallow the truth, we lose ourselves. Betty didn't die quiet. Betty didn't die begging. Betty died standing tall. And that memory, child, that memory needs to live. So settle your heart, take a breath, and walk with me now. Walk back to them, dark quarters of the Carolina Low Country. Walk back to the days when the whipping post guys was the law. Walk back to the moment when one woman's refusal shook the foundations of a whole wicked world. This ain't gonna be easy, but the old ones warned us, truth never is, come on now. Betty's waiting. Now you see, people, the land itself remembers. Down in the Carolina Low Country, where the red clay runs thick as blood, and the air hangs heavy with the ghosts of a million prayers never answered, there's a place folks still won't walk after sundown. They say the ground there is cursed to the 9th generation. And maybe it is. Maybe it should be. Because that ground drank more suffering than any soil ought to carry. This was plantation country, you understand. The kind of place where white men built empires on the backs of stolen people, where our cotton fields stretched wide as the sky, where the burning sun beat down on black flesh from on can't-see morning, till the stars came out to weep. The plantation they called Wexford sat at the edge of the Ashley River, surrounded by thick forest and swampland that swallowed runaways whole. The big house stood tall and white, gleaming like a lie in the morning light, while just beyond it, hidden from polite eyes, sat the Saikuai, slave quarters. Rough cabins made of pine and misery, packed tight with souls who'd forgotten what it meant to dream. In them days of deep sorrow, there was no law for black folk but the masses' word. No justice but what he decided at breakfast. No mercy but what he felt like giving. And, Lord have mercy, he rarely felt like giving none. The overseer at Wexford was a man named Hewitt. Mean as a snake, cruel-hearted as they come. Folks said he could smell defiance on a person the way a hound smells fear. Said he took pleasure in the whipping post, the way some men take pleasure in fine whiskey or Sunday prayer. Hewitt had a saying he liked to repeat, standing there with his iron blade end of a whip coiled in his fist. A nigger that don't bow is a nigger that don't live long. And he meant it, child. Suffering so bad, he meant every word. But here's the thing about cruelty. It breeds resistance the way rain breeds flowers. You can beat a person down, chain them up, work them till they drop. But you can't kill the rebellious soul inside them. Not completely. Not if they hold on to just one piece of who they were before the chains. Betty held on. She came to Wexford in the summer of 1748, brought in on a slave coffles from Charleston's auction block. She'd survived the Middle Passage, meaning that floating tomb where so many of our people perished. And somehow, by the grace of ancestors, or pure stubborn will, she'd come out the other side still breathing. But breathing wasn't the same as broken. From the first day she set foot on Wexford's cruel earth, folks in the quarters knew she was different. She walked with her spine straight, her head held in a way that made the white folks nervous. She didn't shuffle, didn't mumble "yes sir" quick enough, didn't drop her eyes when Hewitt came around meddling and barking orders. Old Mama Dinah, the eldest woman in the quarters, pulled Betty aside one evening after the work bell rang. "Child," she said, voice low and wary, "you gotta learn to bend, These white folks here, they don't tolerate no strong-willed woman, You keep walking like that, keeping your eyes up like that, you gonna bring trouble down on yourself." Betty just looked at her, calm, steady, unafraid. "I already lived through trouble, Mama," she said quiet-like. "Crossed an ocean in chains, watched my kin die in the dark. If trouble gonna find me here, let it come." Mama Dinah shook her head slow, heavy-hearted. "You don't understand, girl. Trouble here don't just find you, it breaks you." But Betty wasn't listening, or maybe she was, and just didn't care. Because some souls, child, some souls would rather die standing ma than live on their knees. And that's the truth. Folks swear on their lives. Even now, all these years later, when the wind blows cold through them empty quarters and the mahaintiwis of Betty's memory still walks that blood-soaked ground, the old ones who warned us. Once a spirit refuses to break, not even death can silence it. And Betty was about to prove that truth in ways nobody, not Hewitt, not the massa, not even God in heaven, could have expected. The quarters carried heavy spirits that night. I tell you now, child, Betty wasn't no ordinary woman. She wasn't the kind that history books remember. 'Cause she never led no army, never wrote no speeches, never stood on no platform for white folks to applaud. But in the sea-dark quarters, at night when the work was done and the iron burden of the day finally lifted, folks whispered her name like it was a me-strong prayer. Because Betty had something most folks lose the moment them chains first lock around their wrists. She had but fire. Now listen here, folk, I ain't talking about rage, though she had that too. I'm talking about the kind of fire that don't go out even when you pour water on it. The kind that burns slow and steady, deep in the chest where no overseer's whip can reach. Betty was born somewhere across the ocean. Far-off place. Nobody could name no more, 'cause them slave traders didn't care about names or homelands, or the fact that every person they stuffed into them ship hulls had a mama who loved 'em, a village that needed 'em, a life that mattered. The old ones say she came from a people who believed the soul couldn't be owned, that a person could be chained, beaten, sold, but the spirit inside, that was between them and the ancestors, and no white man could touch it. Betty carried that belief like a shield. When she first arrived at the auction block in Charleston, standing there half-starved and covered in the filth of the middle passage, the buyers looked her over the way you'd inspect a mule. Checked her teeth, squeezed her arms, made her turn around slow while they decided if she was worth the price. But here's what they didn't see. They didn't see the way her jaw set firm when they poked at her. They didn't see the way her eyes stayed level, never dropping, never begging. They didn't see the rage burning quiet inside her chest, waiting for the day it could finally speak. A man named Thaddeus Wexford bought her that day, paid good money, they say, 'cause she was young and looked strong enough to work the fields till she dropped. He brought her back to his plantation, branded her with his mark like she was cattle, and threw her into the quarters with the rest of the enslaved folk. And that's where the trouble started. See, at Wexford, there was a rhythm to things. A way of surviving that every soul in them quarters understood. Keep your head down, do your work, don't talk back, and maybe, just maybe, you live another day. Betty didn't follow that rhythm. She worked hard, sure, splitting wood, picking cotton, hauling water from dawn till dusk under that killing heat. But she didn't move with fear, didn't flinch when Hewitt walked past, didn't lower her gaze when the massa rode by on his horse, inspecting his property like he was counting livestock. And that child, that made her a marked woman from the start. Hewitt, the overseer, noticed her first. He didn't like the way she stood, too tall, too straight, like she thought she was equal. Didn't like the way she looked at him, not with hate, not with fear, but with something worse, indifference. Like he wasn't worth the effort of her anger. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after she arrived, Hewitt called her over while she was working in the cotton fields. "You," he barked, pointing his whip at her. "Come here, gal." Betty looked up slow, wiped the sweat from her brow, walked over at her own pace, not rushing, not dragging her feet, just walking, like she had a right to her own time. That was the first mistake, according to Hewitt. "When I call you," he said, voice low and dangerous, "you run. You hear me, gal? You don't walk, you don't take your time, you run like your life depends on it. 'Cause it do." Betty looked at him dead in the eye. "I heard you," she said. Not "yes, sir," not "I'm sorry, sir," just "I heard you." Sweet Jesus. The other field hands nearby froze, scared to death, waiting for Hewitt to explode. And he did. Face turned red as the red clay beneath their feet, hand tightening around that whip till his knuckles went white. But before he could swing, old Solomon, one of the elders in the quarters, stepped forward quick, voice shaken but steady. "She new here, sir," Solomon said, bowing his head low. "She don't know the rules yet. I'll teach her, sir. Won't happen again." Hewitt's eyes stayed locked on Betty for a long, dangerous moment. Then he spat on the ground near her feet and walked off, muttering something about stubborn niggers, and teaching lessons. That night, back in the quarters, Solomon pulled Betty aside again, just like Mama Dinah had done before. "Girl," he said, voice tight with worry, "you playing with fire. That man Hewitt, he got a cruel heart. He'd been waiting for an excuse to make an example out of somebody, and you just handed it to him." Betty sat quiet for a moment, staring into the small fire they'd built to cook their meager supper. "I ain't playing," she finally said, voice soft but firm. "I just ain't pretending no more." "Pretending what?" "That I'm less than human." Solomon closed his eyes, heavy-hearted. "Betty, in this place, that's the only way to survive." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and her voice came out gentle, almost sad. "Then maybe I ain't meant to survive, brother Mo." And to this day, folks swear. You could feel the temperature drop in them quarters right then, like the ancestors themselves heard what she said and shivered. Because deep down, everybody knew. A soul that refuses to bend is a soul that's bound to break, or become something powerful, strong enough to break the world instead. Her heart beat like African drums and the spirits listened. "Look here, folk, before we go further, you gotta understand where Betty's fire came from. 'Cause it didn't just appear out of nowhere. No, child. That kind of strength is reforged in hell. And the middle passage? That was hell on water. Betty was taken from her homeland in the dark of night, stolen by slave raiders, who moved through villages like death itself, chains rattling, guns firing, screams echoing through the African night. She was maybe 16, 17 years old. Still had her mama's face fresh in her memory. Still remembered the songs they sang at harvest time. Still could taste the food from her people's land. All that was ripped away in one bloody night. They marched her and dozens of others to the coast, feet bleeding, wrists bound, suffering something terrible. Anybody who fell got kicked till they got up, or left to rot where they dropped. Anybody who cried too loud got beaten silent. Anybody who tried to run. Lord have mercy. They made examples of right there on the trail so the rest would learn. Betty learned, but not the lesson they wanted. She learned that to cruelty had no bottom. That men could look at other human beings and see nothing but profit. That the world was lawless in ways she'd never imagined. And she learned something else too. If you gonna die anyway, might as well die on your feet. When they reached the coast, they threw her and the others into a dark hole. and beneath a stone fortress, the kind of place where the walls wept with dampness and despair. They kept him there for days, maybe weeks, feeding him just enough to keep him breathing, just barely living. Then came the ship. Great God Almighty. The ship was a floating coffin. That's the only way to describe it. When they shoved Betty down into the column, the stench hit her like a fist. Blood, sweat, vomit, death. Bodies packed so tight you couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do nothing but lay there in your own filth and pray for mercy that never came. Chains rattled. In the darkness, babies cried till they couldn't cry no more. Women wailed, prayers in languages the white sailors didn't understand and didn't care to. Men groaned and cursed and begged God to let them die. And some did die. Lord, so many died. They died from fever, from hunger, from heartbreak. Died from the heavy chains, cutting into their flesh till infection set in. Died from suffocating in that airless tomb. Died from losing hope. And that child, that was the cruelest death of all. Betty was chained next to a woman named Adana. Older, wiser, already half gone from the world. Adana had been a one priestess. Back home, a woman who spoke to the ancestors and kept the sacred knowledge of her people. One night, in the pitch-black darkness of the hull, with the ship rocking and creaking like it might split apart any second, Adana whispered to Betty, "They can take your body, child. Chain it, sell it, break it, but your sai bisalo. Your soul belongs to the ancestors. Don't you ever forget that." Betty's voice came out raw, broken. "What good is a soul if my body ain't free?" Adana was quiet for a long moment. Then, "A free soul can haunt. A free soul can resist. A free soul can outlive the chains and the men who made them. That's the power they fear most, child. That's why they try so hard to break us." 3 days later, Adana was dead. The sailors dragged her body up on deck and threw her overboard like she was nothing. Betty heard the splash-ahs from below, heard it clear as a bell, and something inside her snapped. Not broke. Snapped. Like a branch that's been bent too far and springs back full of fury. From that moment on, Betty made a promise to the ancestors, to Adana's spirit, to herself. "If I survive this, I will never bow." And when the ship finally reached Charleston, when they dragged her up onto the auction block, half dead and hollow-eyed, that promise was still burning inside her chest. The root doctor warned us generations later. A soul forged in the Middle Passage don't break easy. It bends the world instead. Betty proved that warning true. Them chains had memory, and so did she. Now you see, people, Wexford Plantation wasn't just a place. It was a machine. A machine built to grind black bodies into cotton, into tobacco, into blood money that filled white men's pockets while souls withered in the highest burning sun. The plantation stretched across 300 acres of a red clay and river bottomland. Cotton fields ran wide as the eye could see, rows and rows of white bolls waiting to be picked by hands that bled from can't-see morning, till the stars came out to witness the crime. At the center stood the Biscay Big House, 2 stories of whitewashed wood and stolen wealth, with columns out front like it was some kind of temple. Inside, Massa Wexford, Yukon, lived in comfort. Feather beds, silver spoons, wine imported from France. His wife wore silk dresses. His children played with expensive toys brought from Europe, all of it paid for by stolen lives. Behind the big house, hidden by a line of oak trees so the Massari wouldn't have to look at it from his breakfast table, sat the Hank slave quarters, 15 rough cabins made of pine logs and mud, packed with anywhere from 8 to 12 souls each. No windows, dirt floors, roofs that leaked when it rained. In summer, the heat inside was suffocating. In winter, the cold cut through the walls like iron blades. This was home. This was hell. The day started before sunrise when the overseer rang the work bell, a sound that haunted folks' dreams. that made children wake up crying, that marked the beginning of another day of endless suffering. You worked till your back screamed, till your hands cracked and bled, till the sun beat down so fierce you thought you might just have dropped dead right there in the field. And if you slowed down, if you took a breath too long, if you looked like you might be high-shirking, the whipping reminded you that your body wasn't yours, that your pain didn't matter, that you were property, and property don't get to be tired. Hewitt, the overseer, walked the fields with his whip always ready, his eyes always watching, his mouth always spewing threats and curses. He had 2 drivers, black men forced to whip their own people to save themselves, and together they kept the machine running smooth. Beside him rode the paddy rollers, poor white men hired to hunt runaways, to terrorize any black soul caught off the plantation without a supassis, to remind everybody that gay freedom was just a dream that'd get you killed. The quarters at night was where souls tried to remember they was human. Folks gathered round small fires, cooking whatever scraps they could scrounge. Fatback, cornmeal, sometimes a possum or fish somebody managed to catch. They sang Ming spirituals, soft and low, praying for deliverance that seemed like it had never come. They told stories from the old country, trying to hold on to memories that slavery tried to steal. And they whispered about runaways who made it north, whispered about the Underground Railroad, that secret network of safe houses and brave souls, whispered about Moses, a woman named Harriet who came back again and again to lead her people out, whispered about conjure women who could put spells on cruel masters, about eat root doctors who knew how to poison without leaving traces, whispered about resistance. But it was dangerous talk. One wrong word to the wrong person and you'd find yourself at the whipping post. Or worse, most sold down the river to the deep south, where they worked folks to death in the rice fields and cane plantations. So most folks kept their heads down, survived however they could, loved each other quiet-like, tried to protect their children from the worst of it. That was the rhythm of Wexford. That was the U.S. Devil's design. Betty understood it all within her first month. She saw how the Cochrane system worked. Break the body first, then the spirit. Separate families. Sell children away from mothers. Use fear and violence and aches and exhaustion to make folks too tired to dream of freedom. She saw it. She understood it. And she hated it. With every breath she took. One night, sitting by the fire with the other women, Mama Dinah tried to explain how to survive. You gotta be cunning, child. Smile when they lookin'. Say, yes, sir, and no, ma'am. Make yourself small, invisible. That's how you live long enough to see your babies grow. Betty stared into the flames, quiet for a long time. Then she said, voice soft but steady, what if I don't want to just survive, Mama? What if I want to live? Mama Dinah shook her head. Worried sickie. Living and surviving is the same thing here, girl. You best learn that quick. But Betty already knew different. She'd learned it in the cow belly of that slave ship, huh? She'd learned it from Adana's dying words. She'd learned it in the deepest part of her rebellious soul. Some things are worse than dying. That land carried heavy spirits, and the earth remembered every tear. Listen here, child. In the world of slavery, there was rules. Unspoken rules that every black soul learned quick if they wanted to keep breathing. Rule number 1, never look a white man in the eye. That was the most important one. See, the white folks needed you to believe you was less than human. Needed you to act like it, think like it, feel it in your bones. And the quickest way they measured that was through your eyes. Drop your gaze. You understood your place. Keep your eyes level. You was trouble. Betty kept her eyes level. It wasn't defiance for defiance's sake, and wasn't her trying to provoke nobody. It was just, she couldn't pretend no more. Couldn't act like she was something less when she knew in her soul she wasn't. The old folks say pride comes before a fall. But sometimes, child, pride is all you got left. Hewitt, the overseer, noticed her from the very start. The way she walked through the cotton fields, with her back straight as a pine tree. The way she worked hard but didn't scramble like she was scared to death every second. The way she looked at him when he barked orders, not with hatred, not with fear, but with something that made his blood run cold. Indifference. Like he was nothing. Like his whip and his power and his whiteness didn't matter one bit to her. And that drove him clean out of his mind. One afternoon, about a month after Betty arrived, Hewitt decided to test her. He called her over while she was hauling water from the well. Heavy burden on her shoulders, sweat pouring down her face in that killing heat. "You," he said, pointing with his whip. "Come here, gal, now." Betty set the water bucket down slow, wiped her hands on her dress, walked over at her own pace, not running, not dragging her feet, just walking, like a free woman. Hewitt's jaw tightened. "When I call you, you supposed to run it, gal. You deaf or just simple-minded?" Betty looked at him dead on, didn't blink, didn't lower her gaze, just looked. "I heard you," she said, voice calm. "I'm here." Sweet Jesus. The other field hands nearby froze, waiting for the explosion, and it came. Hewitt's face turned red as a whipping post-wick stained with blood. His hand clenched tight around that whip handle. "You got spirit, don't you?" he said, voice low and dangerous. "Too much spirit, that's for your own good." He stepped closer, boots crushing the red clay beneath him. "Let me tell you something, gal. I break you strong-willed women you'd like you before breakfast. You understand? You ain't special. You ain't different. You just another nigger who ain't learned her lesson yet." Betty stayed quiet, but her eyes, Lord have mercy. Her eyes said everything her mouth wouldn't. Said, "You don't scare me." Said, "I survived worse than you." Said, "Do what you gonna do, 'cause I ain't bokin'." Hewitt raised his whip. Before he could strike, old Solomon ran over, voice shaken with fear. Sir, please. She new here, don't know the ways yet. I'll teach her right, I promise, won't happen again." Hewitt paused, whip still raised, eyes locked on Betty's face. Then he lowered it slow, not out of mercy, but out of something worse. Calculation. "You right, Solomon," he said, voice cold. "She knew. She don't know yet. But she gonna learn. Oh, she gonna learn real good." He leaned in close to Betty, close enough she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Next time you look at me like that, gal. Next time you walk instead of run. Next time you act like you somebody. I'm gonna teach you a lesson you won't never forget." Then he walked off, leaving Betty standing there in the burning sun. Heart pounding but head still high. That night in the U-quarters, all folks gathered round her, worried sick. "Girl, you playing with fire," Mama Dinah said, voice tight. "That man Hewitt, he got a mean streak and wide as the river. He been looking for somebody to make an example of, and you just volunteered." "I didn't volunteer nothing," Betty said quiet. "I just refused to pretend." "Pretend what?" "That I'm an animal." The quarters went silent as death. 'Cause everybody knew, the ancestors knew, the spirits knew, even God Almighty knew, that a woman who refused to be broken was a woman marked for destruction. But also, maybe, just maybe, a woman marked for legend. Folks swear on their lives that you could feel the shift that night, like the dare itself got heavier, like something was coming, something terrible and powerful all at once. And Betty just sat by the fire, staring into the flames like she could see the future there, like she already knew how this story was gonna end. In the quiet of the quarters at night, the ancestors whispered warnings. "I tell you now, there's moments that change everything. Moments when the world tips on its axis, when a soul decides who it's gonna be, when history holds its breath and watches to see what happens next." For Betty, that moment came on a hot morning, in late August when the sun rose like a curse over them cotton fields. and the air hung thick with the promise of violence. Hewitt had been watching her for weeks, set in a trap, waiting for the right moment to teach her a lesson. The whole plantation would remember, and that morning, he found his excuse. Betty was picking cotton, moving down the row with her sack half full, when Hewitt rode up on his horse and stopped right beside her. "You behind on your quota, gal," he said, voice sharp. "Everybody else got 2 sacks filled. You got 1. It wasn't true. Betty knew it, and so did the other field hands. She'd been working just as hard, just as fast. But truth didn't matter on a plantation, only the wide masses' word and the wide overseer's whim. Betty straightened up slow, wiped the sweat from her face. "I've been working steady, sir," she said, voice calm. "Same as everybody else." Great God Almighty. The way she said sir, no fear in it, no begging, just a word dropped flat like a stone. That was all Hewitt needed. "You calling me a liar, gal?" "No, sir, just telling you I've been working." Hewitt's face twisted into something ugly. He climbed down off his horse slow, boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. "You got a mouth on you," he said. "Time somebody taught you to shut it, try." He pulled the whip from his belt, that long leather iron blade that had tasted the blood of so many souls. The other field hands kept their heads down, scared, breathless, praying they wouldn't be next. "Come here," Hewitt said. Betty didn't move. "I said, come here, gal." Betty looked at him with them calm eyes. "Why?" Jesus wept. That one word, why, hung in the air like a thunderclap. 'Cause slaves didn't ask why. Slaves said yes, sir, and moved quick before the whip found them. Slaves knew their place. Slaves bowed. Hewitt's voice came out low, dangerous. "You really want to find out what happens when you disobeys me?" Betty's voice was quiet but steady. "I ain't disobeyed nothing. I've been working. You the one looking for trouble." That was it. That was the moment. Hewitt grabbed her by the arm, rough, brutal, and dragged her toward this whipping tree. An old oak at the edge of the field where the hot blood-soaked ground never grew grass no more. The other slaves watched, hearts in throats, knowing what was coming but powerless to stop it. Hewitt tied Betty's wrists to the tree, pulled her arms up high so her back was exposed. She didn't scream, didn't beg, just stood there, breathing steady, jaw set firm. "This is what happens," Hewitt announced loud enough for everybody to hear. "When a nigger forgets her place, when she gets too much spirit, when she thinks she's somebody." He raised the whip and brought it down. The sound of leather, meat, and flesh echoed across them. Cotton fields. A sound that made grown men flinch, made women close their eyes and pray. But Betty didn't scream. The whip came down again, and again, and again. 5 lashes. 10. 15. Her back split open like a river finding its path. Blood ran down and soaked into the ground. That cruel earth drinking more suffering like it was thirsty for it. But through it all, sweet Jesus, through it all, Betty never cried out, never begged for mercy, never broke. And that child, that scared Hewitt, more than any scream ever could. 'Cause he'd whipped plenty of folks before. Heard 'em beg, heard 'em cry, heard 'em promise to be good, promise to obey, promise anything, just to make it stop. But Betty just took it. Like her body was there, but her soul was somewhere else. Somewhere he couldn't reach, somewhere the whip couldn't touch. When he finally stopped, arm tired, breath heavy, he untied her and let her drop to the ground. "Maybe now you learned," he said, voice shaken just a little. Betty pushed herself up slow, stood on shaking legs, back a-screaming with pain, blood dripping onto the red clay, and then, Lord have mercy. She looked at him again, same calm eyes, same steady gaze. Unbroken. Hewitt's face went pale. "Get back to work," he said, voice cracking. "All of you." He climbed on his horse and rode off quick like he was running from something. And maybe he was, 'Cause what he saw in Betty's eyes that day wasn't defeat. It was more warning. The silence in the quarters speaks loud when words can't. Now listen here, folk. I gotta explain something that most people don't understand about slavery. It wasn't just about iron chains and whips and hard labor. No, child. That was just the body a part of it. The real weapon, the one that kept millions of souls in bondage, even when they outnumbered their masters 10 to 1, was the chain they put in your mind. See, the white folks understood something deep and wicked. You can't control a people forever through violence alone. Violence makes bodies comply, but it also breeds rage. And rage, given time, turns into the rebellion. So they had to go deeper. They had to make folks believe the lie. The lie that said, you ain't fully human. The lie that said, this is God's will. The lie that said, you were born to serve. The lie that said, resistance is suicide. They preached it from pulpits in plantation churches, where white preachers twisted scripture to say, slaves should obey their masters as unto the Lord. They beat it into children from birth, so they'd grow up thinking chains were natural. They separated families, sold babies away from mothers, broke every bond of love and kinship so folks wouldn't have nothing worth fighting for. The old ones warned us. The deepest wound is the one that makes you forget you're wounded. And that's what slavery did. It made folks forget they was ever meant to be free. Most people, Lord have mercy, most people couldn't fight that. Not 'cause they was weak, but 'cause the me system was designed perfect like to crush the spirit before it could even dream of freedom. You wake up in chains every day, you watch your children sold away, you see every act of resistance end in full blood and death. You hear white folks say over and over that you ain't human. Eventually, some part of you starts to believe it, starts to think, maybe this is just how things are. Starts to think, maybe survival is the best I can hope for. Starts to think, maybe if I just bow low enough, they won't hurt me today. And that's exactly what the amasser and the way overseer wanted. Broken souls don't rebel. Hopeless people don't run. Folks who believe they're animals don't remember they got human rights. But here's the thing, child. The thing that terrified slaveholders more than anything. Sometimes somebody remembers. Sometimes, despite the whip and the chains and the lies and the endless suffering, a soul holds on to that one piece of truth. I am human. I was meant to be free. And when that happens, when somebody like Betty refuses to internalize the lie, when they keep their whole spine straight why and their hot eyes leveled, no matter what, the whole system starts to crack. 'Cause if the one person vices can resist the invisible chains, then maybe others can too. If one woman vices can stand at the batty whipping posties and not break, then maybe the lie ain't as strong as they thought. That's why Hewitt was so riled up about Betty. That's why he beat her so vicious. That's why he needed to break her, publicly, in front of everybody. It wasn't about her cotton quota. It wasn't about her disobedience. It was about the threat she represented, the threat of an unbroken soul. See, slavery depended on folks believing it was inevitable, natural, permanent, God-ordained. But Betty's eyes said different. Her silence under the whip said different. Her refusal to bow said different. And that message, that dangerous, powerful, revolutionary message, was spreading through them, quarters, like fire through dry grass. Folks started whispering after that day at the whipping tree. You see how she took them lashes? Didn't cry once? Looked at Hewitt like he was nothing? Maybe we don't gotta bow neither. The ancestors knew, and Hewitt knew, that those whispers was more dangerous than any wake to run away, any maroon, any act of sabotage. 'Cause those whispers was hope. And hope, child, hope is the one thing slavery can't survive. That's why what happened next was bound to happen. Why the confrontation was written in fate. Why Betty's story was always going to end the way it did. 'Cause the moment a slave stops being afraid is the moment the whole wicked system starts to tremble. That night carried heavy spirits and the winds whispered change. Come close now, child, 'cause this is where everything changed. This is the moment that sealed Betty's fate and cracked open a truth so powerful that white folks been trying to bury it ever since. It happened on a September morning, 3 weeks after the first whipping. Betty's back was still healing. Scars raised like rivers across her skin, each one a testimony to her refusal to break. She moved slower than before, pain shooting through her with every step, but she still worked, still kept her head high, still looked folks in the eye. And Hewitt watched her like a hawk watching prey. He'd thought the whipping would fix her, thought it'd teach her to shuffle and bow like everybody else, but it hadn't. If anything, Betty seemed even more determined, like the whip had burned away whatever fear she might have had left. That morning, Hewitt called the field hands together before work started, lined them all up in front of the conquarters, whip in hand, face hard as stone. "I've been too soft on y'all," he announced, voice carrying across the yard. "Too merciful. Some of you forgetting what happens when you get out too much spirit, when you think you are somebody." His eyes found Betty in the crowd. "You," he said, pointing his whip at her. "Step forward." Betty's heart beat steady in her chest, like African drums, like her ancestors' hands guiding her. She stepped forward slow, face calm. "You still got that rebellious look about you," Hewitt said. "Still walking around like you ain't learned your lesson, so we gonna try again." He nodded toward the she-whipping tree. "Go on over there, you know the drill." The other slaves held their breath, scared to death, waiting to see what Betty would do. And Betty, sweet Jesus, Hugh, Betty just stood there. Didn't move toward the tree, didn't drop her eyes, just stood. "I said, go," Hewitt repeated, voice rising. "You deaf gal?" Betty's voice came out quiet but clear as a bell. "No." "Lord have mercy." That one word, simple, small, just 2 letters, and hit the air like thunder. "What you say?" Hewitt's face went red. Betty looked at him steady. "I said no. I ain't going to that tree. I ain't taking no more whipping. I worked hard. I ain't done nothing wrong, and I ain't accepting punishment for nothing." The silence that followed was and deathly. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even the birds went quiet, like nature itself was holding its breath. 'Cause this wasn't sabotage done in secret. Wasn't a runaway slipping off in the night. This was open defiance. A slave woman saying no to a white man's face in front of 50 witnesses. This was a revolution in a single word. Hewitt's hand trembled on his whip. You refusing me?" "I'm refusing to be beaten for nothing," Betty said. "You want me to work, I'll work. You want me to pick cotton, I'll pick cotton. But I ain't bending over for your whip no more. Not without cause. Not just 'cause you feel like reminding folks you got power. Great God Almighty." Hewitt looked around at the other slaves, saw the way some of them was watching Betty with wide eyes. Not with fear, but with something else, something dangerous. Admiration. Hope. Possibility. He knew right then, in that very moment, that if he didn't crush this, if he didn't make Betty an example so brutal that nobody would ever dare follow her lead, he'd lose control of the whole plantation. "You just signed your death warrant, East gal," Hewitt said, voice shaken with rage. "You understand that? You just killed yourself." Betty's voice stayed calm. "Then I die going stand and go. But I ain't boking no more." Hewitt turned to 2 of the drivers. Black men forced to do the masses' violence. "Grab her, drag her to the tree, strip her back and tie her up. I want 50 lashes. I want her broken, koti or dead. Don't care which." The drivers hesitated. You could see it in their faces. See the conflict tearing at them. But chains don't just bind wrists. They bind her choices too. They stepped toward Betty, and she didn't run, didn't fight, just stood there, powerful, strong, like she was daring the whole wicked world to do its worst. But before they could reach her, old Solomon stepped forward, voice cracking. Sir, please, let me talk to her. Let me make her see reason. This don't gotta—" "Shut your mouth," Hewitt roared. "Anybody who speaks for her gonna join her at that tree." Solomon fell silent, tears streaming down his face. The drivers grabbed Betty, and as they dragged her toward the be-whippin' tree, she turned her head one last time and looked at the other slaves. Really looked at them. Her eyes said what her mouth didn't need to. Remember this. Remember that somebody said no. Folks swear to this day that the very air shifted in that moment, that the ancestors themselves leaned down from the other side to witness, that history cracked open like an egg, and something new, something terrible and beautiful, was about to be born. And that's how the world learned a soul can't be owned. I tell you now, what happened next wasn't about Betty no more. It was about fear. See, Hewitt dragged her to that whipping tree and gave her them 50 lashes like he promised, beat her till the mob blood ran like rivers, till her back was nothing but raw meat and exposed bone, beat her till his own arm got tired and he had to switch hands, and through it all, sweet Jesus, through it all, Betty never screamed, never begged, never broke. She passed out somewhere around the 30th lash, body finally giving out what her soul refused to surrender. But even unconscious, even half dead, there was something about her that wouldn't submit. The other slaves watched in horror and awe, two feelings mixing together in a way that made folks' hearts beat strange. Horror at what was being done, awe at the fact that a human being could endure it without losing herself. When Hewitt finally stopped breathing heavy and shaking all over, he looked down at Betty's broken body and realized something that made his blood run cold. He'd lost. Not the whipping, he'd won that easy enough. But the high battle end beneath it, the one that really mattered, the one about kind power and kind control, and who gets to define what a person is worth. That battle, Betty won it the moment she said no. Hewitt left her tied to that tree, bleeding and unconscious, while he went to find Massa Wexford. The other slaves was ordered back to work, but they moved like ghosts. Minds somewhere else, hearts carrying a weight they couldn't name. Mama Dinah whispered to Solomon as they walked back to the fields, "That girl gonna die." Solomon nodded, heavy-hearted. "I know it. But she gonna die unbroken. I know that too." Up at the Toole big house, Hewitt found Massa Wexford in his study, sipping brandy and reviewing plantation accounts like Betty's blood wasn't soaking into the ground 50 yards away. "We got a problem, sir," Hewitt said, voice tight. Wexford looked up, annoyed at the interruption. "What kind of problem?" "That new gal, the one with the spirit. She openly refused punishment this morning, in front of everybody." Wexford set down his glass slow. "Refused?" "Yes, sir. Said she wouldn't accept the whip no more. Said it plain, sir, bold as brass." "Lord have mercy." Wexford's face went hard. See, he understood something most folks didn't. Slavery was theater. It was a performance to power that only worked if everybody believed in it. If the slaves believed they was property. If the poor whites believed they was superior. If the whole wicked system kept spinning on the lie. But if one person, just one, stood up and said no, if they did it publicly, if they survived it, if other slaves saw it, the whole performance could collapse. "Where is she now?" Wexford asked. "Whipped her 50 times, sir. She at the tree unconscious. Might not make it through the night." Wexford stood up, walked to the window, looked out at his vast cotton fields, stretching toward the horizon, his empire built on high stolen lives and high broken backs. "If she dies from the whipping," he said slow, "then the problem solves itself. But if she lives, He turned to face Hewitt, eyes cold as January. "If she lives, we can't let her stay here. Can't sell her neither. She'll just spread that rebellious one spirit wherever she goes. And we damn sure I can't let her keep walking around this plantation with her head up, showing the others that defiance don't get punished proper." "What you want me to do, sir?" Wexford was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options like he was calculating the cost of livestock. Then he said the words that would seal Betty's fate. "If she lives through the night, hang her." Great God Almighty. Hewitt's eyes went wide. "Sir, hang her. That's a valuable piece of property. Cost good money." "I don't care," Wexford said, voice flat. "You can't put a price on control, Hewitt. And right now that woman is threatening the control I got over 300 souls. She's worth more dead than alive, long as her death teaches the lesson I need taught." He poured himself another brandy. "Make it public, make it slow. And make sure every slave on this plantation watches. I want 'em to see what happens when you forget your place." Hewitt nodded, but his hands was shaking. 'Cause even he, cruel-hearted on as he was, understood what they was doing. They wasn't just killing a woman. They was murdering. The possibility that slaves was human. They was hanging. The idea that black folks had dignity, had rights, had souls worth defending. They was executing truth itself. And somewhere deep inside his wicked heart, Hewitt knew, you can kill a woman, but you can't kill what she represents. The old ones warned. Blood spilled for freedom seeds, the ground for revolution. Betty's blood was about to water that ground. The plantation swallowed the truth, but the earth remembered every drop. "Now listen here, child. I gotta tell you something that's gonna make your blood run cold. In them days, a slave could be executed without no trial, without no jury, without no judge, without even a piece of paper saying what crime they committed. All it took was the masses' word. That's right, the same man who owned you, who bought and sold you like cattle, who worked you till you dropped. That man was also your judge, your jury, and your executioner. There was no law protecting black folks, no court you could appeal to, no justice except what white folks decided over breakfast. And if they decided you needed to die, you died. Simple as that." Betty woke up that night in the quarters waist, a back screaming with pain, body burning like fire. Mama Dinah. And some of the other women had cut her down from the tree after Hewitt left, carried her back to her cabin, laid her on her stomach, and done what they could, which wasn't much. "She gonna die anyway," one woman whispered. "Ain't no surviving a whipping like that." But Betty's eyes opened slow, focused on the ceiling. "Not dead yet," she whispered, voice raw. Mama Dinah leaned close. "Girl, you gotta pray. Pray God have mercy on your soul, 'cause these white folks sure ain't gonna." Betty's lips moved, but it wasn't no prayer to the white man's God. It was something else, something older, something in a language Mama Dinah didn't recognize but felt in her bones. African words, calling to the ancestors, asking them to bear witness. The root doctor warned, when the living can't get justice, the dead will take it. The next morning, Hewitt came to the quarters with 2 drivers and a rope. The slaves knew what that meant. Everybody knew. "Where's that gal Betty?" Hewitt called out. Nobody answered. Nobody moved. Hewitt kicked open the door to her cabin, found her lying there, barely breathing, back torn to pieces. "Get up," he said. Betty didn't move. He kicked her side, not hard enough to kill, just enough to cause suffering. "I said to get up. Mass's orders, you've been sentenced." Betty's eyes opened slow. Sentenced for what? Insubordination, refusal to obey, threatening the order of this plantation. Betty's voice came out quiet but clear. "I didn't threaten nobody. I just said no to being beat for nothing. That's the same thing, gal. Now get up or I'll drag you." with effort that made the watching women had cry silent tears. Betty pushed herself to her knees. Then, slowly, painfully, she stood, back bleeding through the rough cloth they'd wrapped around her, legs too shaken, but standing. Hewitt tied her hands in front of her with the rope. "It's a short walk," he said, "to the big oak at the edge of the property. That's where we gonna hang you. Massa wants everybody to watch so they know what happens to rebellious souls who think somebody." Betty looked at him with them calm eyes. The same eyes that had haunted Hewitt since the day she arrived. "I am somebody," she said soft. "Always was. You just never wanted to see it." Sweet Jesus. Hewitt's face went pale. He yanked the rope, pulling her forward. As they walked through the quarters, and slaves emerged from their cabins. Men, women, children, all watching in silence. Some had tears streaming down their faces. Some had white rage burnings in their eyes. Some just looked broken, like they was witnessing the death of hope itself. But a few, just a few, looked different. They looked at Betty and saw something that would haunt their dreams and fuel their resistance for years to come. Dignity in the face of death. Hearing courage when everything was lost. Humanity that couldn't be whipped away. Old Solomon whispered as she passed, "May the ancestors receive you, daughter." Betty nodded once. Young children clung to their mamas, scared to death, but unable to look away. And Betty, Lord have mercy. Betty walked with her shucks spine straight, head up, like she was walking to her coronation instead of her execution. By the time they reached the big oaks, the tree with branches thick enough to hold a rope, the tree that had witnessed too many horrors to count, Massa Wexford was already there, sitting on his horse, face hard. Behind him stood the white overseer crew, the paddy rollers, the drivers, and every slave from the plantation, forced to watch. Wexford's voice rang out cold and clear. "Let it be known that this woman, called Betty, has been found guilty of insubordination, defiance, and threatening the peace and order of this plantation. The sentence is death by hanging, to be carried out immediately. No trial, no defense, no appeal, just death. 'Cause that's what justice looked like for black folks in 1748. Folks swear on their lives and that the sky went dark right then, like even heaven wore it was turning its face away from the wickedness about to be done. And Betty just stood there, unbroken, to the very end. Written in fate, carried by the winds of sorrow. Come close now, child, 'cause this part is where words almost fail me. But I gotta tell it anyway. Gotta make sure you understand what happened that day under the big oaks at Wexford Plantation." Betty stood beneath that tree with a rope in Hewitt's hands and 300 souls watching. Some forced to witness, some unable to look away, all carrying a weight that would live in their chests for the rest of their lives. The children didn't understand. They tugged at their mama's dresses, asking why that lady was tied up, why everybody looked so scared, why the air felt so heavy, like a storm was coming, but no clouds was in the sky. The mamas couldn't answer. Just held their babies tight and whispered in prayers that got stuck in their throats. The men stood with fists clenched, jaws tight, rage, burning inside but nowhere for it to go. 'Cause if they moved, if they spoke, if they did anything to try and stop this, they'd be next. And the white folks knew it. Massa Wexford sat on his horse like a king on a throne, face cold as stone, watching the whole scene like it was theater. Hewitt stood beside the tree with that rope, hands shaking. Just a little, not from fear, but from something else. Something he couldn't name. Guilt, maybe. Or maybe just the whole weight of knowing he was about to murder an innocent woman and call it to justice. And Betty stood there, hands still tied, back still to bleeding. Through the cloth, body, barely standing but to spirit. Lord, have mercy. Her conspiratus was something else entirely. She looked out at the crowd of slaves, her rice people, her rakin, Folks who'd shown her kindness in them dark quarters. Folks who'd tried to warn her, tried to save her, tried to teach her how to survive. And her eyes said what her mouth didn't need to. I see you, I love you, don't forget me. Old Solomon couldn't hold it no more. Tears streamed down his weathered face, and he called out, voice cracking. Betty, Betty child, is there anything you want to say? Any last words, Mo? The white folks tensed, expecting her to beg, expecting her to cry out for mercy, to promise she'd be good, to do what slaves was supposed 'em to do when faced with death. But Betty just looked at Solomon with them calm eyes and said, voice soft but clear, tell him I died. Free. Great God Almighty. The words hung in the air like what thunder. 'Cause she wasn't free. Not legally, not physically. She was about to be hanged like property, like an animal, like something less than human. But in her soul, in that place where the whip couldn't reach and the chains couldn't bind, she was free, always had been. And they could kill her body, but they couldn't take that freedom away. Mama Dinah let out a wail. The kind that comes from deep in the chest, from a place where our grief, thought, and rage, guile, and love all mixed together into something that sounds like the earth itself crying out. Other women joined her, voices rising in a mournful song that had no words, just sound. Pure, raw, ancient. The white folks shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The slaves was supposed to be silent, terrified, obedient. But this sound, it was an accusation. It was a testimony, and it was the ancestors speaking through the living saying, we see what you doing, and heaven sees it too. Wexford barked at Hewitt. Get on with it. Hewitt threw the rope over a thick branch, tied the other end in a noose ways, and slipped it over Betty's head. The rough hemp pressed against her neck. Betty closed her eyes for just a moment, and in that moment, folks swear, the wind stopped blowing. The birds went silent. Even the insects hushed, like nature itself was holding its breath, like the whole world paused to witness. When Betty opened her eyes again, she looked up at the sky, that big Carolina sky stretching wide and blue above the horror happening below, and she smiled. Sweet Jesus, she smiled. Not a happy smile, not a peaceful one, but a smile that said, you can't break me. You never could. Hewitt looked at Massa Wexford, waiting for the order. Wexford's voice came out cold, flat, final. Do it! And in the silence that followed, that terrible, heavy, suffocating silence, the only sound was the creak of the rope as Hewitt pulled it tight. Betty's feet lifted off the cruel earth. And the world just like watched. The quiet of the quarters at night never sounded the same again. I tell you now, child, there are moments so heavy, they bend time itself. Moments when hot heaven and earth meet in the most hot terrible as way. Moments that echo through generations, carrying weight that never gets lighter, only spreads wider, touching more souls as the years go by. Betty's death was one of them moments. When her feet left the ground and the rope pulled tight around her neck, something shifted in the air. Something the white folks couldn't see, but every black soul felt, deep in their bones. The ancestors leaned in close. The spirits had gathered round that tree like witnesses at a trial, and the earth itself, that red Carolina clay, stained with so much blood and my suffering, seemed to groan under the weight of one more injustice. Betty's body swung high, slow in the breeze that had suddenly picked up, a strange wind that hadn't been there a moment before, carrying with it the smell of rain that wouldn't fall and thunder that wouldn't sound. Her eyes stayed open for a few terrible seconds, looking up at that sky, at that freedom. She could see but never touch. Then they closed. The children buried their faces in their mama's skirts, crying. Without understanding why, The mamas held 'em tight and tears streaming, bodies shaken with 'em grief. They couldn't show too much or they'd be punished for it. The men stood, frozen, hands clenched, so tight their nails drew blood from their palms. Rage, with nowhere to go. Pain with no voice. Love forced into silence. And through it all, that strange wind had kept blowing, rustling through the leaves, making the rope creak, carrying Betty's spirit, somewhere the chains couldn't follow. Old Solomon fell to his knees, face turned toward heaven, lips moving in a prayer so old it came from before the Middle Passage, before the slave ships, before white men ever set foot on African soil. He was calling to the ancestors in a language even he didn't fully remember, but his soul knew. Mama Dinah saw her started humming, low and mournful, like spiritual, that had no words, just sound. Other women joined her, voices blending together into something that sounded like earth itself weeping. The white folks shifted uncomfortable. This wasn't supposed to happen. The slaves was supposed to be terrified as into submission, supposed to see Betty's death as a warning and fall in line. But instead they was mourning her like she was somebody, like she mattered, like her death was a crime instead of justice. And that scared the white folks more than any rebellion ever could. 'Cause if the slaves saw Betty as unhuman, if they saw her death as murder, if they remembered her instead of forgetting, then the whole coily seers that slavery was built on started to crumble. Massa Wexford must have felt it too, 'cause his voice came out sharp. "That's enough. Back to work, all of you. Show's over." But nobody moved. Not at first. They just stood there, eyes fixed on Betty's body, eyes swinging. Gentle in that strange wind, like they was memorizing every detail, burning it into their minds so they'd never forget. "I said, shall move!" Wexford roared. Hewitt cracked his whip in the air, a sound that usually sent folks on running. Done. But this time they moved slow, reluctant, like their bodies was obeying, but their souls was staying behind, refusing to leave Betty alone. As they walked back toward the quarters nice in the cotton fields, something passed between them. Something unspoken, but understood. Betty didn't die begging. Betty didn't die broken. Betty died proving that a black soul couldn't be owned. And that knowledge, that dangerous, powerful, revolutionary knowledge, started spreading like fire through dry grass. In the cop quarters, that night, folks sat in silence, heavier than any words. Children asked questions their parents couldn't answer. Men stared into fires with hollow eyes. Women hummed spirituals that sounded more like accusations than prayers. And somewhere in that silence, something changed. The fear that had kept folks so obedient east for so long started to crack, not disappear. Fear don't disappear when you're surrounded by whips and the chains and a death, but it cracked. And through them cracks, something else started to seep in. Anger, determination, memory. The root doctor warned long ago. A martyr's death don't end a movement, it starts one. And Betty's death started something that couldn't be stopped, couldn't be whipped away, couldn't be hanged from no tree. It started the slow, steady burnings of a truth that would eventually set the whole wicked system on fire. We are human, we deserve freedom, and we will remember. Up at the U's big house, Massa Wexford poured himself a drink with Chow shaking hands. He'd won, hadn't he? He'd crushed the rebellion, killed the threat, restored order. So why did he feel like he'd just lost something he could never get back? Why did that strange wind keep blowing high through his windows, carrying with it a whispered rain that sounded like Betty's voice? Why couldn't he shake the image of her eyes, calm, steady, unafraid? Even in death? Folks swear to this day that Wexford never slept well again after that. That he'd wake up in the night, sweating, shaking, claiming he heard the voices and in the wind. And maybe he did. Maybe the she ancestors made sure he heard. That night carried heavy spirits, and the dead spoke louder than the living. Now listen here, folk. The white folks thought Betty's death would solve their problem. Thought it would put the fear of God back into the slaves, make them remember their place, restore the order that Betty had threatened just by refusing to bow. But something strange started happening at Wexford Plantation after that day. Something the Massa and the overseers couldn't quite name, couldn't quite see, but could feel it in their bones like a fever coming on. The slaves went back to work, yes. Picked their cotton, hauled their water, followed orders. But there was a difference as now. Unshifted and so subtle the white folks almost missed it. The fear was still there. How could it not be with our whips on and how chains how and the memory of Betty's body and swinging on from that tree? But beneath the fear, beneath it, was something harder. Something like stone. Old Solomon noticed it first. The way folks moved through the quarters wide at night with their spines just a little straighter. The way they spoke Betty's name in whispers that carried more weight than shouts. The way the children asked questions about her that the mamas couldn't silence no more. Who was Betty? They'd ask, and the mamas would answer, voices low but firm. She was one of us. She said, no, and they killed her for it. Why she say no, mama? 'Cause she remembered she was a human, ow. Sweet Jesus. Them words, simple as they was, started spreading like seeds in soil, started taking root in young minds that hadn't been fully broken yet. Started growing out into something the white folks couldn't see, but would eventually have to reckon with. Meanwhile, up at my big house, things was falling apart in ways Massa Wexford couldn't understand. The slaves was obedient, more obedient than ever on the surface. But the work was different, slower, sloppier, like folks was moving through water, reluctant, resistant, in ways too small to punish but too consistent to ignore. Cotton got picked, but not as much. Tools got used, but broke more often. Orders got followed, but took longer to complete. It was sabotage. So quiet, so subtle, that you couldn't prove it was intentional. But it was. Lord, it was. And Hewitt felt it most of all. He walked them fields, Yuan, with his whip always ready, but something had changed in the way folks looked at him. They still dropped their eyes, still said, yes, sir, still moved when he barked. But there was a coldness waxing now, a distance like they was looking through us him instead of a sat to him, like he was already dead on to them. One night, alone in his cabin, Hewitt woke up all sweating, heart to pounding, convinced he'd heard something outside his door. He grabbed his gun, threw open the door, and found nothing. Just the dark quarters, stretching out before him. Just the wind blowing through them cabins. Just the silence that somehow felt louder than any noise. But he could have sworn, Lord, he could have sworn that he'd heard a voice, Betty's voice, whispering his name. He slammed the door shut, locked it, poured himself whiskey till his hands stopped shaking. But the whisper stayed with him, in the rustle of leaves, in the creak of floorboards, in the space between sleep and waking where haints walk free and the guilty can't hide. The old ones say, when you kill an innocent soul, you don't just bury a body, you plant a ghost. And Betty's ghost was everywhere. In the Miwik quarters women started humming a new song, one they claimed came to them in dreams. It had no words, just a high melody that sounded like sorrow mixed with high strength, like grief that refused to break. The white folks tried to forbid it, but you can't forbid a can't punish a mitun that lives in the chest and escapes without permission. So it spread, from cabin to cabin, from mother to child, from field hand to house slave. Derikirk's song without words, that said what words couldn't. We remember Betty. We remember she didn't bow, and something in us died with her, but something else was born. 6 months after Betty's death, a young man named Isaiah, barely 20 years old, was caught stealing bread from the smokehouse. Hewitt dragged him to the whipping post, ready to beat him bloody like he'd done 100 times before. But this time, when Hewitt raised his whip, Isaiah looked him dead in the eye and said, voice steady, "Go ahead, you can whip me, you can kill me, but you can't make me less than human." Betty taught us that. Hewitt froze, whip raised, hand trembling. And in that moment, that single terrible moment, he understood. He'd lost. Not the battle. He still had the whip, still had the power, still had the masses use authority. But the war for their souls, that war was slipping away. 'Cause you can chain a body, but you can't chain a memory. And Betty's memory was burning bright in every heart on that plantation. Folks swear the wind still carries her name through those fields. Come close now, child, 'cause this is where I gotta tell you about the second death. The first death is when the body stops breathing. The second death is when the name gets erased from memory. The white folks who killed Betty thought they could do both. Thought they could hang her body and to bury her story so deep that nobody would ever find it. And for a long time, they almost succeeded. See, in the official records of Wexford Plantation, the ledgers kept by Massa Wexford himself, Betty's death got recorded like this. Negro woman Betty, approximately 18 years of age, executed for insubordination and threat to plantation order. September 1748. Property loss, $45. That's it, that's all. No mention of what she actually did. No mention of her refusal to be whipped for nothing. No mention of her courage, her dignity, her unbroken spirit. Just property loss, like she was a broken plow or a dead horse. And that, folk, is how they tried to erase her. But here's what them white folks didn't understand. Paper don't hold the whole truth. Paper can record a death, but it can't record the impact. Can't record the wereruck and whispers in the quarters. Can't record the songs that carry a memory forward. Can't record the way a story gets passed from grandmother to granddaughter, from elder to child hobby, in voices too low for white folks to hear but loud enough to echo through generations. The old ones warned. History belongs to whoever tells the story, but memory belongs to whoever lived it. And the people who lived. Betty's story, they didn't forget. They told it in coded spirituals. That sounded like they was about Moses and the Promised Land, but was really about resistance and refusal, and the women and men who died rather than bow. They told it in hush harbors, them secret meeting places deep in the woods where slaves gathered to pray and speak truth without white folks listening. They told it in quilts, sewn with patterns that looked like decoration but was really maps and messages and testimonies stitched in cloth. They told it in the names. They gave their children names that carried weight, names that meant strong, resistant, unbroken. For generations, Betty's story lived in the oral tradition of enslaved people. It spread from plantation to plantation, carried by runaways mice on the Underground Railroad. Whispered by four conductors, who guided souls to freedom, shared in for praise houses, where black folks could finally speak without fear. And every time the story got told, it grew a little. Not with lies, no, the truth was powerful enough, but with meaning, with purpose, with the understanding that Betty wasn't just one woman who said no. She was every woman who ever refused to be broken. She was every man who ever stood tall in the face of death. She was every child who ever asked, but why? Why we gotta be slaves? She became symbol. She became legend. She became testimony. But in the official history, In the books written by white scholars who never asked black folks what they remembered, in the archives and kept by plantation owners and their descendants, Betty was nothing. A footnote. The statistic, the property loss noted in a ledger and forgotten. It took centuries for her story to surface again. Took researchers digging through dusty archives in Charleston and Columbia, finding them plantation records, matching dates and names, realizing that the executed Negro woman mentioned in one document was connected to the oral histories that black families had been keeping alive all along. And even then, most historians ignored it, called it unverifiable, said there wasn't enough evidence, claimed that oral history wasn't as reliable as written records, like the one written records and weren't created by the very people who benefited from slavery, like the oral histories weren't kept alive by the very people who survived while sieging it. I tell you now, history ain't always in the books. Sometimes it's in the songs grandmamas sing. Sometimes it's in the stories and great-granddaddies tell on the porch. Sometimes it's in the box silences between words, in the pauses that carry more weight than any sentence. Betty's story survived, not because white folks recorded it proper. It survived because we, her people, her black descendants who in spirit if not in blood, refused to let her die twice. We kept her name alive. We kept her courage alive. We kept her high testimony alive. And now, today, when you hear Betty's story, you gotta understand, this ain't just about one woman in 1748. This is about all of us who came from people who refused to be broken. This is about remembering that our ancestors weren't just victims. They was warriors. They was resistors. They was human beings who chose dignity over survival, truth over safety, freedom over fear. And that memory, that powerful, dangerous, revolutionary memory, is what the mice plantation owners mice tried to bury. But memory, child, memory is stubborn. It survives. And sometimes, when the time is right, it rises up from the earth like a voice calling from the grave, demanding to be heard. Betty's voice is calling still. You hearing it? The earth drank blood that day, but the story grew roots deeper than any grave. Now we come to the end, child, but endings ain't always what they seem. See, Betty's body died that day in September 1748, swinging from that base to a big oak, under a sky that seemed to weep without tears. But her spirit, her testimony, her truth, that never died, never could. 'Cause what Betty proved, what she burned into the conscience of every soul who witnessed her death, was something the slaveholders feared more than any rebellion, any uprising, any act of violence. You cannot own a soul that knows its own worth. Betty walked to that tree with her back torn open and her body barely standing, but with her dignity intact. She refused to beg, refused to bow, refused to pretend she was all less than human, just to make white folks comfortable. And in that refusal, Lord have mercy, in that simple, powerful, revolutionary refusal, she became, immortal. Not in the way white history makers become immortal, with statues and monuments and their names carved in stone, but in the way our people make someone immortal, through memory, through story, through the whispered of past from grandmother to child in the quiet of night, when truth can finally breathe. Betty became a touchstone, a reminder. I promise him that even in the darkest times, even when the whole world tells you that you ain't worth nothing, you can choose him to remember your humanity. And that choice, that dangerous, beautiful, costly choice, changes everything. It changed the slaves at Wexford who watched her die and never forgot what they saw. It changed the children who grew up hearing her story and learned that resistance don't always look like violence. Sometimes it looks like a standing still, like saying no, like we refusing to pretend. Change the runaways in rear, who heard her name whispered on the Underground Railroad, and found courage to keep moving when their feet was or bleeding eye, and the po paddy rollers you was closing in. It changed the CU freedom fighters, who came generations later, who stood at lunch counters and why marched through streets and why set door on buses, carrying the same spirit Betty carried. The spirit that says, "My dignity is not negotiable." To the old ones warned, a soul that dies for truth becomes a seed, and seeds given time become forests. Betty was that seed, and the forest that grew from her sacrifice, that forest is us. Is every black person who ever stood tall despite the calf, chains in Rurik. Is every voice that ever said no to injustice. Is every heart that ever chose Gao freedom over your fear, Tao, truth, over your Tao safety, humanity, over your survival. So, today when you walk through the Carolinas, through them old plantation grounds that's now been turned into museums and historical sites, you won't find Betty's name on no plaque, won't see her face on no memorial. But if you listen, really listen, you can hear her. In the co-wind that blows through them. Cotton fields. In the co-rustlings of leaves on trees that witnessed too much suffering. In the silence that hangs heavy over ground soaked in with the blood of our ancestors. She's there. Always there. Whispering to anyone who'll hear, remember. Remember what they did. Remember what we survived. Remember that your life, your beautiful, precious, irreplaceable life, is worth fighting for. Worth dying for, if it comes to that. So I ask you now, as we close this story, will you remember Betty? Will you speak her name when the world tries to forget? Will you stand a little taller, a little stronger, knowing that her blood waters the ground you walk on? Will you refuse to bow when the world tells you that you ain't mom-worthy? 'Cause that's her legacy, child. That's her de-gifting to us. Not just the memory of her death, but the powers of her life. A life that said with every breath, every step, every defiant look, I am human, I am worthy, and I will not be broken. Sweet Jesus, what a testimony, what a witness, what a soul. And now her story lives on, not in plantation ledgers or history books written by folks who never knew suffering, but here, in car voices, in car memories, in the sacred space where truth is kept alive by those who refuse to forget. Betty, the Zen Forcada. Betty who said, "Oh no, Betty whose Zen spirit still walks free." We remember. We testify. We carry her forward. Those who suffered, suffered. Those who resisted left memory. And memory is something we keep right here, where voices never die, where the ancestors still walk, where truth echoes louder than silence, in the echoes from the quarters.